Richard Harper woke up at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as he did every day. The alarm on his custom-made phone barely finished its first chime before his hand reached out to silence it. He didn't need the alarm anymore. 20 years of the same morning. Routine had trained his body to wake up automatically. But Richard was a man who believed in backup systems. The 52-year-old billionaire swung his legs over the edge of his king-sized bed and stretched. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his bedroom, he could see the sun starting to rise over the city. The view from his penthouse apartment showed tiny cars moving along streets that looked like veins from this height. Richard owned much of what he could see. He walked to his bathroom, a space bigger than most people's living rooms. The shower turned on automatically as he approached, already set to his preferred temperature. As the water hit his skin, Richard mentally reviewed his schedule for the day. Board meeting at 10, lunch with potential investors at 1, conference call with the Tokyo office at 4. And then, he paused, remembering, breakfast with Lily at 8. Richard frowned. He had almost forgotten about his promise to his 12-year-old daughter. She had been asking for weeks to have breakfast with him at a regular diner instead of at home with their private chef. The idea seemed strange to Richard. Why eat average food in a crowded place when they could have anything they wanted, prepared perfectly at home? But Lily had insisted, and Richard had a hard time saying no to her lately. Ever since the divorce from her mother 3 years ago, he had tried to make up for his absence with gifts and occasional outings. It rarely seemed enough. After his shower, Richard dressed in a suit that cost more than what most people earned in a month. His closet held 50 similar suits, all nearly identical, except for small differences in color and fabric. He didn't care much about fashion. The suits were simply another system, another way to remove unnecessary decisions from his day. As he walked down the curved staircase to the main floor of the penthouse, Richard checked his phone. 27 new emails had arrived overnight. His assistant had already sorted them by importance. Nothing that couldn't wait until after his breakfast with Lily. He found his daughter sitting at the kitchen island, already dressed in jeans and a purple sweater. Her long brown hair was tied back in a ponytail and she was reading something on her tablet. She looked up when he entered and smiled. "Morning, Dad. Ready for our breakfast?" Richard nodded, checking his watch. "We should leave in 15 minutes to avoid traffic." Lily rolled her eyes. "It's just a few blocks away. We could walk." The idea of walking to a restaurant seemed as foreign to Richard as eating at a diner. He hadn't walked anywhere as a mode of transportation in years. His days were carefully scheduled, with his driver taking him exactly where he needed to be with no wasted time. "We'll take the car," he said, already sending a message to his driver. Less chance of being recognized. This was partly true. As the founder and CEO of Harper Technologies, Richard's face occasionally appeared in business magazines and news shows. But the real reason was simpler. Richard Harper didn't walk places. It wasn't efficient. Lily sighed but didn't argue. Small victories were still victories in her ongoing battle to make her father act like a normal person. 20 minutes later, Richard's sleek black car pulled up in front of a small building with a worn sign that read, "Sunny Side Up Diner." Richard looked at it through the tinted windows and felt a strange twinge of memory. He had eaten at places like this when he was younger, before his company took off, before he became someone who had chefs and assistants and drivers. "Are you sure about this place?" he asked Lily. She was already opening her door. "Mom used to bring me here all the time. They have the best pancakes." This was news to Richard. His ex-wife Caroline had never mentioned bringing Lily to diners. But then, there were probably many things about his daughter's life that he didn't know. As they walked toward the entrance, Richard instinctively adjusted his tie and straightened his shoulders. Even in a simple diner, he carried himself like a man entering a boardroom. Habits were hard to break. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. The smell hit Richard immediately. Coffee, bacon, syrup, toast. Simple smells, but somehow comforting. The diner was about half full, mostly with people in work clothes having breakfast before their shifts. A woman in her 50s approached them with menus in hand. She wore a simple blue uniform with a name tag that read, Nancy. Her Hair was graying at the temples and smile lines framed her eyes. "Good morning, table for two?" Nancy asked cheerfully. "Yes, please," Lily answered before her father could speak. "Can we sit by the window?" "Of course, sweetie. Right this way." Nancy led them to a booth by the window. Richard slid onto the vinyl seat and was surprised by how uncomfortable it was compared to the ergonomic chairs he was used to. He watched as Lily settled in across from him, looking completely at ease. "I'll give you folks a minute with the menus. Coffee for you, sir?" Nancy asked. Richard nodded. "Black, please." "And for you, young lady? Hot chocolate? Orange juice?" Lily grinned. "Hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, please." Nancy winked at her. "Coming right up." As Nancy walked away, Richard opened his menu and frowned at the laminated pages. Everything was so basic. Eggs, pancakes, toast, no organic options, no specialty coffees, nothing like the carefully crafted breakfasts his chef prepared. "What are you going to get, Dad?" Lily asked, not even looking at her menu. She clearly already knew what she wanted. "I'm not sure," Richard said, scanning the options again. "What do you recommend?" "The blueberry pancakes are amazing, or the French toast." Lily's eyes were bright with excitement. "This is nice, isn't it? Just us having breakfast like normal people." Richard wasn't sure normal was something to aspire to, but he smiled anyway. "Yes, it's different." Nancy returned with their drinks. A plain white mug of coffee for Richard and a large mug of hot chocolate topped with a mountain of whipped cream for Lily. "Ready to order?" Nancy asked, pulling a pen from behind her ear. "I'll have the blueberry." "Pancakes, please," Lily said. Richard closed his menu. "Just toast for me. Whole wheat if you have it." Nancy wrote down their orders. "Sure thing. I'll have that right out for you." As Nancy walked away, Richard reached for his phone out of habit. He had 3 new emails since leaving the penthouse. He began to read the first one, his fingers poised to type a response. "Dad," Lily said, her voice carrying a hint of disappointment. "You promised. No work during breakfast." Richard looked up, momentarily confused. Then he remembered. Yes, he had promised that. With a small sigh, he put his phone face down on the table. "You're right. I'm sorry." Lily smiled and took a sip of her hot chocolate, leaving a small whipped cream mustache on her upper lip. Richard found himself smiling too, and for a brief moment he forgot about his emails and meetings and conference calls. The diner grew busier as they sat there. Nancy moved efficiently between tables, greeting customers by name, laughing at their jokes, remembering their usual orders. Richard watched her with a kind of fascination. She seemed to know everyone, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to see her. When had he last experienced that kind of simple human connection? Richard couldn't remember. His interactions were all carefully managed, by his assistant, by his PR team, by the natural distance that extreme wealth created between himself and others. Their food arrived quickly. Lily's pancakes were piled high, drowning in syrup and butter. Richard's toast was plain and slightly burnt around the edges. He took a bite and was surprised to find it wasn't terrible. As they ate, Richard tried to think of things to talk about. Work was his usual topic of conversation, but that wouldn't interest Lily. He settled on the safest option. "How is school going?" Lily shrugged. "It's fine. We're doing a science project about ecosystems. I got paired with Ben, who's really smart, but super quiet." Richard nodded, trying to look interested. "That sounds educational." "Dad," Lily said, rolling her eyes again, "you don't have to pretend to care about my school stuff." "I do care," Richard protested, feeling a pang of guilt. "I just don't know much about ecosystems." Lily laughed. "That's okay. I'd rather talk about other stuff anyway. Like, why did you pick this suit today? Do you have a big meeting?" Richard blinked, surprised by the question. No one ever asked him about his clothing choices. "I have a board meeting at 10. I always wear dark blue for board meetings." "Why?" Lily asked, genuinely curious. Richard had to think about it. "Studies show dark blue conveys trust and competence. It's a psychological advantage. Lily considered this as she chewed her pancakes. That's kind of weird, Dad. But also kind of cool that you think about stuff like that. For some reason, this made Richard feel good, that his daughter found something about him cool, even if it was just his calculated choice of suit color. As they continued eating, Richard found himself watching Nancy again. She moved with purpose, never wasting a step as she took orders, delivered food, refilled coffee cups, and chatted with customers. There was something almost artistic in her efficiency, but also a warmth that Richard's own efficiency lacked. Richard finished his toast and took another sip of his coffee. The diner was now packed with the morning rush. People stood near the entrance, waiting for tables to open up. The noise level had risen with the clinking of forks against plates, the hum of many conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Richard noticed that despite the crowd, Nancy never seemed to rush or lose her patience. Lily had eaten only half of her pancakes before declaring she was full. She now stirred what remained of her hot chocolate, watching the activity in the diner, with bright, curious eyes. Richard checked his watch. They had been here for 30 minutes already. His board meeting was in just over an hour, and he still needed to review some financial reports before then. We should probably get going soon, Richard said, reaching for his phone. Lily's face fell slightly. Already? But we just got here. It's been half an hour, Lily. I have a meeting at 10. Can't you be late just once? Or skip it? Lily asked, hope in her voice even though she knew the answer. Richard shook his head. That's not how things work, sweetheart. 20 people will be waiting for me. The company depends on these meetings. Lily sighed and nodded, used to this response. Richard felt a familiar twinge of guilt. He started to compose a text to his driver when Nancy appeared at their table with a fresh pot of coffee. Refill, sir? She asked, already pouring before Richard could answer. Thank you, Richard said, noticing how the simple white mug looked so different from the expensive handcrafted coffee cups he used at home. Nancy smiled at Lily. Not a fan of the pancakes today, sweetie? They were really good, Lily assured her. I just can't eat that much in the morning. Nancy nodded understandingly. I'll bring you a box to take the rest home. No sense in wasting good pancakes. As Nancy turned to get the box, Richard pulled out his wallet and extracted a $100 bill. The total bill would probably be less than $30, but he never carried smaller bills. Nancy returned with a small foam container and the check. Here you go, sweetheart, she said to Lily, who began carefully transferring her remaining pancakes into the container. Richard handed Nancy the $100 bill. Keep the change. Nancy looked at the bill, then at Richard, with a slightly embarrassed smile. That's very generous, sir, but I don't think I can make change for this right now. Let me check with my manager. No need for change, Richard said with a dismissive wave. Consider it a tip. Nancy's eyes widened slightly. She hesitated, then carefully folded the bill and placed it in her pocket. That's extremely kind of you, thank you very much. As Nancy walked away, Lily watched her with a thoughtful expression. Dad, why did you give her so much money? Richard shrugged. It's not that much money, Lily. But why? Lily persisted. Was it because you felt sorry for her? The question caught Richard off guard. No, not at all. It's just what you do. You tip well when you can afford it. Lily seemed to consider this, still watching Nancy as she moved from table to table. Nancy was now taking an order from an elderly man who appeared to be a regular customer. She laughed at something he said, placing her hand gently on his shoulder with obvious familiarity. She knows everyone here, Lily observed. Not just their names, but like really knows them. Richard followed his daughter's gaze. It was true. Nancy moved through the diner like it was her living room and the customers were all friends stopping by for a visit. There was an ease to her interactions that seemed foreign to Richard. In his world, most relationships were formal, strategic, or at the very least carefully maintained with clear boundaries. She's probably worked here a long time, Richard said, unsure why they were still discussing the waitress. She looks happy, Lily said, her voice thoughtful. She turned her gaze to her father. Dad, why does she look so happy when you have so much more money than her? Richard froze. his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The question hit him like a physical blow. He lowered the cup slowly, buying time as he tried to formulate a response. The question wasn't just unexpected, it was uncomfortably perceptive. "What do you mean?" he finally managed to ask. "Well, you always say money lets people do what they want and have nice things. But Nancy doesn't have much money, right? She works really hard carrying food to people all day. But she's smiling all the time. She knows everyone's names. You make millions of dollars, but you never smile like that at work. Why is she happier than you?" Richard stared at his daughter, genuinely stunned by the depth of her question. He glanced over at Nancy, who was now ringing up a customer at the register, chatting animatedly. From nearby tables, he caught snippets of conversation, people talking about their kids' baseball games, weekend plans, a new movie that had just come out. Simple conversations about simple things, yet everyone seemed engaged, present in a way that Richard rarely experienced in his own life. "Dad?" Lily prompted, when Richard didn't answer. I don't know, Lily," he admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Richard Harper was not a man who often said, "I don't know." He was paid millions to know things, to have answers, to make decisions with confidence. Lily seemed surprised by his honesty. "Really? You don't know?" Richard shook his head slowly. "Happiness is complicated. It's not just about money." "But you always work so hard to make more money," Lily pointed out. "You miss my recitals and parent-teacher meetings because you say work is important. If money doesn't make you happy, why do you work so much to get it?" Each question felt like another blow, forcing Richard to confront contradictions he usually kept safely tucked away. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, not caring that he was messing it up. "It's not that simple, Lily. Money gives us security. It pays for your school, our home, our life." "I know," Lily said, "but we already have enough for all that stuff, right? Mom says you have more money than we could spend in 100 lifetimes." Richard felt a flash of irritation at his ex-wife for discussing his finances with their daughter, but he had to admit, she wasn't wrong. His net worth was over $3 billion. Even if he never worked another day in his life, Lily's grandchildren would still be wealthy. Before Richard could formulate a response, Nancy returned to their table. "All set?" she asked with a smile. "How was everything?" "Wonderful, thank you," Richard said automatically, his businessman's manners taking over despite his inner turmoil. Nancy turned to Lily. "And did you enjoy your pancakes, sweetie?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "They were the best, way better than what our chef makes." Nancy laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "Well, that's quite a compliment. You have your own chef?" "My dad does," Lily explained, gesturing toward Richard. "He makes lots of fancy food, but it's not as good as your pancakes." Nancy smiled at Richard. "Sometimes the simple things are the best, aren't they?" "Yes," Richard heard himself say. "Sometimes they are." As they prepared to leave, Richard noticed that Nancy was helping an elderly woman who had just entered the diner. The woman moved slowly with a cane, and Nancy had rushed over to hold the door and guide her to a table, chatting with her the whole way. There was no impatience in her manner, just genuine care. "Does she get paid extra to help people like that?" Lily asked, following her father's gaze. "No," Richard said quietly. "She does it because she wants to." "That's nice," Lily said simply. As they walked toward the exit, Richard found himself looking around the diner with new eyes. The place was nothing special. Worn booths, outdated, decor, simple food. Yet there was a warmth here, a sense of community that was palpable. When was the last time he had been in a place where people knew each other's names and stories? Where they took the time to ask about each other's lives and actually cared about the answers? Richard held the door for his daughter as they stepped outside. His driver was waiting exactly where he'd been instructed to wait. The sleek black car looked oddly out of place in front of the humble diner. "Can we come back here again sometime?" Lily asked as they settled into the back seat. Richard looked back at the diner, then at his daughter's hopeful face. For the first time in a long while, he felt something shift inside him, a small but significant crack in the armor of routine and expectation he had built around himself. "Yes," he said. I think we will. As the car pulled away from the curb, Richard didn't immediately check his phone as he usually would. Instead, he kept looking out the window, watching the city scroll by, his mind still in that small diner where a waitress named Nancy seemed to have figured out something about life that had somehow eluded him, despite all his wealth and success. Lily's question echoed in his mind. Why does she look so happy when you have so much more money than her? It was a question Richard suddenly very much wanted to answer. Richard sat in the boardroom, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits. Charts and graphs displayed on the large screen showed rising profits and expanding markets. The company's latest product launch had exceeded all expectations, and the stock price was at an all-time high. By any measure, this meeting should have been a victory lap for Richard Harper, CEO and founder of Harper Technologies. Yet Richard found his mind drifting back to the diner, to Nancy's genuine smile, to his daughter's question. Mr. Harper, your thoughts on the Asia expansion? Richard blinked, pulling his attention back to the meeting. His chief operating officer, Alan Porter, was looking at him expectantly, along with the rest of the board members. Richard straightened in his chair and cleared his throat. The Asia expansion makes sense on paper, he said, falling back on familiar business language. But I want more information on how it will affect our current employees and production quality. Several people around the table exchanged surprised glances. Richard Harper was known for his aggressive expansion strategies. He had built his empire by moving fast, taking risks, and prioritizing growth above all else. Employee concerns had never been his first consideration. We can certainly gather that information, Alan said, clearly caught off guard, though it might delay the timeline by a few weeks. Then we delay, Richard said firmly. Do it right or don't do it at all. The meeting continued, but Richard found himself seeing everything through a new lens. When the discussion turned to cost-cutting measures that would eliminate 100 jobs, Richard questioned the necessity. When the marketing team presented a campaign that stretched the truth about their product's capabilities, he rejected it outright. By the end of the meeting, the board members were exchanging confused looks. As people filed out of the boardroom, Richard overheard one executive whisper to another, "What's gotten into Harper today? He's acting like he suddenly grew a conscience." Richard lingered in the empty boardroom after everyone left. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city below. From the 50th floor, the people on the streets looked like tiny dots. He owned the entire building, Harper Tower, they called it. His name lit up the skyline at night. And yet, standing here now, he felt strangely empty. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Lunch with investors in 30 minutes, car waiting downstairs. Richard texted back, "Cancel lunch, clear my schedule for the rest of the day." His phone immediately rang. Richard answered, knowing it would be his assistant, Kate, who had worked for him for 8 years and had never known him to cancel a meeting with important investors. "Is everything okay, Mr. Harper?" Kate asked, concern evident in her voice. "Everything's fine, Kate. I just need some time to think." "But sir, these investors flew in from Dubai specifically to meet with you." Richard sighed. "Reschedule for tomorrow. Offer them tickets to the opera tonight, my private box. And have the chef at Harper Restaurant prepare them a special dinner, on me." "Yes, sir," Kate said, still sounding concerned. "May I ask what you'll be doing instead?" Richard realized he didn't have an answer. What did he want to do with this sudden free time? The question itself felt strange. His schedule was always planned weeks in advance, every hour accounted for, and optimized for maximum productivity. "I'm going for a walk," he said finally, surprising himself as much as his assistant. "A walk?" Kate repeated, as if she had misheard. "Do you want security to accompany you?" "No, just me." Richard ended the call before Kate could ask any more questions. He removed his suit jacket and tie, leaving them draped over a chair in the boardroom. Then he rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt and loosened the top button. When he reached the lobby of Harper Tower, the security guards did a double take. Richard Harper always left the building in his car, from the private underground garage. He never walked through the main lobby, and he certainly never left the building alone on foot in the middle of a workday. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harper," one guard said, recovering quickly. "Shall I call your car?" "No need," Richard said with a small smile. "I'm walking today." Outside, the busy city street was filled with noise and movement. People rushed past, most staring at their phones, few making eye contact. Richard stood still for a moment, feeling oddly exposed without his usual bubble of cars, assistants, and security. He picked a direction and started walking. At first, he felt self-conscious, wondering if people recognized him. But he soon realized that in this busy city, he was just another man in a white shirt. Without his usual trappings of wealth and power, he was virtually invisible. Richard walked for blocks, paying attention to things he normally missed when viewing the city through the tinted windows of his car. Street vendors selling hot dogs and pretzels. Musicians playing for tips. People sitting on benches, feeding pigeons or reading books or simply watching the world go by. After about 20 minutes, Richard found himself in front of a small park. He entered and found an empty bench near a fountain. Sitting down, he watched as children played on a nearby playground, their laughter carrying across the park. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along a path lined with flowers. A young woman sat under a tree, completely absorbed in a book. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, even if that purpose was simply enjoying the moment. Richard tried to remember the last time he had sat in a park with no agenda, no phone calls to make, no meetings to attend. Had it been years? Decades? A memory surfaced. Himself as a young man, maybe 22, sitting in a park much like this, one with a notebook sketching out the idea that would eventually become Harper Technologies. He had been poor then, working out of his tiny apartment, eating ramen noodles to save money. But he remembered the fire inside him, the excitement of creating something new, something that could change the world. Somewhere along the way, that fire had dimmed. The company had grown from a dream into a behemoth, and Richard had transformed from an eager young inventor into a billionaire CEO who measured success in stock prices and market share. Richard's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Lily. "Dad, can we have dinner together tonight? Mom's going out with friends." Richard smiled and texted back immediately. "Absolutely. What time should I pick you up?" Lily's response came quickly. 6:30? Can we go to that pizza place we went to for my birthday last year? Perfect. See you then. Richard put his phone away and continued sitting in the park, his mind now filled with thoughts of his daughter. Lily was growing up so fast. In a few years, she would be a teenager, then off to college. How many more chances would he have for pizza dinners and breakfasts at diners? His ex-wife Caroline had warned him about this when they divorced 3 years ago. "You're missing her childhood, Richard," she had said. "One day you'll wake up and she'll be grown, and you'll wonder where the time went." At the time, Richard had dismissed her concerns. He was providing for Lily, giving her every advantage money could buy, the best schools, the best teachers, the best opportunities. Wasn't that what a good father did? But sitting here now, Richard wondered if he had been wrong. Maybe what Lily needed most wasn't his money, but his presence, his attention, his time, and maybe, just maybe, that was what Richard needed too. The afternoon wore on. Richard continued his walk through the city. He passed shops and restaurants he had never noticed before. He bought a hot dog from a street vendor and ate it while walking, something he couldn't remember ever doing before. When he passed a bookstore, Richard stopped and went inside. The shop was small and cramped, with books stacked everywhere. An older man behind the counter looked up as Richard entered. "Can I help you find something?" the man asked. Richard wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he found himself saying, "Do you have any books on happiness?" The man smiled and led Richard to a section near the back of the store. Philosophy, psychology, self-help, we have all sorts of approaches to happiness. Richard browsed the shelves, eventually selecting 3 books. As the man rang up his purchases, he made friendly conversation, asking Richard if he worked nearby. "Yes," Richard said simply, not mentioning that he owned the tallest building in the city's skyline. "What line of work are you in?" The bookstore owner asked. Richard hesitated, then said, "Technology, but I'm trying to figure out what's next." The man nodded wisely as he handed Richard his books in a paper bag. "Aren't we all, my friend? Aren't we all?" Outside, Richard checked his watch. It was almost 5:30. He needed to head to Caroline's apartment to pick up Lily for dinner. He thought about calling his driver, then decided against it. Instead, he hailed a taxi, another thing he hadn't done in years. As the taxi made its way through evening traffic, Richard opened one of his new books and began to read. The first chapter was titled, "Redefining Success." Richard smiled at the irony. By any traditional measure, Richard Harper was one of the most successful men in the country, and yet here he was, questioning everything because of a simple question from his 12-year-old daughter about a waitress in a diner. The taxi pulled up in front of Caroline's building, a luxury apartment complex on the east side of the city. Richard paid the driver and stepped out, books tucked under his arm. He took a deep breath and pressed the buzzer for Caroline's apartment. "It's Richard," he said when she answered. "Come on up. Lily's almost ready." As the elevado, Richard and Lily sat in a corner booth at Tony's Pizza, a family-owned restaurant they had visited a few times before. The place was nothing fancy. Red and white checkered tablecloths, slightly dimmed lighting, and the rich smell of tomato sauce and freshly baked bread filling the air. Families occupied most of the other tables, their conversations creating a warm background hum. Lily was in the middle of telling Richard about her science project, her hands moving animatedly as she described the ecosystem diorama she was building. With her partner, Ben, "We're showing how everything depends on everything else," she explained. "Like if you remove one thing, even something small like a certain bug, it can mess up the whole system." Richard listened with genuine interest, noticing how his daughter's eyes lit up when she talked about things that excited her. Had he missed this before? How many other conversations had he half listened to while checking emails or thinking about work? Their pizza arrived, half cheese for Lily, half pepperoni for Richard. It was hot and bubbling, nothing like the gourmet pizzas prepared by his personal chef, but somehow more appealing. "This looks amazing," Richard said, and meant it. Lily grinned. "I told you this place has the best pizza." She took a big bite and then asked, "How was your day, Dad? Did you have important meetings?" Richard carefully considered his answer. Usually he would give some vague response about stocks or deals, things he assumed Lily wouldn't understand or care about. But tonight felt different. "I did have meetings," he said, "but the more interesting part was what I did after. I canceled my afternoon appointments and went for a walk around the city." Lily's eyes widened in surprise. "You? Walking around the city? By yourself?" Richard laughed at her shocked expression. "Is that so hard to believe?" "Kind of, yeah," Lily said with a giggle. "You never just walk places, you're always in your car with your driver." "Well, today I wanted to see things differently," Richard said. "I went to a park and just sat for a while. Then I visited a bookstore." "A real bookstore? Not just ordering books online?" Richard nodded, amused by his daughter's continued amazement. "A real bookstore with actual shelves and a grumpy old man who owns it." "What kind of books did you get?" Lily asked, reaching for another slice of pizza. Richard hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Books about happiness, actually. I've been thinking about what you asked this morning, about Nancy at the diner." Lily's expression turned serious. "About why she seems happier than you even though you have more money." "Yes, that." Richard took a sip of his water. "It was a good question, Lily. A really good question that made me think." "Did you find an answer?" Lily asked, her voice curious rather than challenging. Richard shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm looking for one." They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments. Richard found himself studying his daughter's face, the shape of her eyes, the small dimple in her left cheek when she smiled, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear just like her mother did. How had he not noticed these details before? "Dad," Lily said suddenly, "are you unhappy? Is that why my question bothered you so much?" The directness of her question caught Richard off guard. His first instinct was to deny it, to assure her that everything was fine. But the events of the day had left him feeling unusually open, vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. "I don't think I'm unhappy exactly," he said slowly, trying to find the right words. "But I'm not sure I'm really happy either. I think I've been too busy to ask myself that question for a long time." Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mom says you work too much. She says you're afraid to stop because you don't know who you'd be without your company." Richard felt a flash of irritation that Caroline was discussing him this way with their daughter, but he had to admit there was truth in her words. "Your mother might be right," he admitted. "Work has been my life for so long. It's hard to imagine anything else. But there is other stuff," Lily said as if stating the obvious. "Like having pizza with me, or going to parks, or talking to nice waitresses at diners." Richard smiled. "Yes, there's definitely other stuff." After dinner, they walked outside, into the cool evening air. Richard had arranged for his driver to pick them up, but the car wasn't there yet. "Can we walk for a bit?" Lily asked. "Just around the block?" "Sure," Richard agreed readily. They strolled down the sidewalk, Lily occasionally skipping a few steps ahead and then waiting for her father to catch up. They passed shop windows still lit up despite the late hour, other people out enjoying the evening, a street musician playing a saxophone on the corner. "Do you like music, Dad?" Lily asked as they paused to listen to the saxophone player. Richard considered the question. "I suppose I do. I have season tickets to the symphony." "But do you actually like it? Or do you just go because it's what rich people do?" Lily asked with startling insight. Richard laughed, surprised by her perception. "That's a fair question. I'm not sure I've really thought about it." "What was the last song that made you happy? Like, really happy?" Richard had to think hard. When was the last time he had really listened to music for pure enjoyment, rather than as background noise at a fundraiser or charity event? "There was a song I used to play a lot when I was first starting the company," he said, memory suddenly returning. "It was called Don't Stop Believin' by a band called Journey." Lily grinned. "I know that song. We learned it in music class." "It's super old." "Hey, it's not that old," Richard protested with a smile. "It's older than me," Lily countered, "which makes it ancient." They continued walking, and Richard found himself humming the old song under his breath. He had almost forgotten how much he loved it, how he used to play it in his tiny apartment when he was coding late into the night, believing that his ideas could change the world. When had he stopped believing in things like that? When had life become about quarterly reports and stock prices instead of dreams and possibilities? His driver called to say he was waiting around the corner. As they walked toward the car, Lily slipped her hand into her father's, something she hadn't done in years. The simple gesture made Richard's heart swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thanks for pizza, Dad," Lily said as they reached the car. "This was nice." "Yes," Richard agreed. "It really was." On the drive back to Caroline's apartment, Lily fell asleep with her head resting against her father's shoulder. Richard sat very still, not wanting to disturb her. He looked down at his daughter's peaceful face and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. When they arrived, Richard gently woke Lily. "We're home, sweetheart." Lily blinked sleepily. "Will you come in and say hi to Mom?" Richard hesitated. His relationship with Caroline since the divorce had been civil but distant. They communicated about Lily but rarely spent time together. "Sure," he said, surprising himself again. Caroline opened the door, looking surprised to see Richard standing there with Lily. "You're actually walking her to the door? Who are you and what have you done with Richard Harper?" she joked, but there was genuine curiosity in her eyes. "Dad canceled his meetings today and went for a walk in the park," Lily announced proudly, as she stepped inside. "And he bought books about happiness." Caroline raised an eyebrow, looking at Richard with new interest. "Really? That doesn't sound like the Richard I know." "Maybe I'm not quite the Richard you knew," he said quietly. Caroline studied him for a moment. "Would you like to come in for coffee? Lily needs to get ready for bed, but we could talk." Richard nodded. I'd like that. While Lily got ready for bed, Richard and Caroline sat in her kitchen with cups of coffee between them. The apartment was stylish but comfortable, much warmer than Richard's minimalist penthouse. "So," Caroline said, "Lily tells me you had an interesting day." Richard smiled. "That's one way to put it. Want to talk about it?" Richard took a deep breath and told her about breakfast at the diner, about Lily's question regarding the waitress, about his strange day of canceled meetings and walks in the park. Caroline listened without interrupting. When he finished, she shook her head with a small smile. "Leave it to Lily to ask the one question that could crack the great Richard Harper's armor. She gets her insightfulness from you," Richard said. "And her stubbornness from you," Caroline countered with a smile. They sat in comfortable silence. For a moment, the tension that had existed between them for years somehow lessened. "You know," Caroline said finally, "I always hoped you'd have this realization someday. I just didn't think it would take a waitress in a diner to make it happen." "Neither did I," Richard admitted. "But I'm glad it did." Lily came in to say goodnight, first hugging her mother and then throwing her arms around her father with unusual enthusiasm. "Will you take me to breakfast again soon?" she asked Richard. "How about this weekend?" he suggested. Lily's face lit. "At the same diner?" Richard nodded. "Same diner. Maybe we can talk to Nancy again." After saying goodnight to Lily, Richard prepared to leave. At the door, Caroline touched his arm lightly. "For what it's worth, Richard, I think this is good. Whatever caused this change, I'm glad it happened." "Me too," Richard said, "though I'm not sure where it leads." Caroline smiled. "Maybe that's the point. For once in your life, you don't have everything planned out 10 steps ahead." As Richard rode back to his penthouse in his car, he thought about Caroline's words. 3 months had passed since that first breakfast at the diner. The seasons had changed, summer fading into early fall. Leaves in the city park were beginning to turn golden and red, and people walked with light jackets against the morning chill. Richard and Lily sat at their usual table by the window at Sunny Side Up Diner. They had made it a tradition to have breakfast together every Saturday morning. Nancy greeted them with a warm smile as she approached their table. "Good morning, you two." "The usual?" Nancy asked, already writing on her notepad. "Yes, please," Lily said. "Blueberry pancakes and hot chocolate with extra whipped cream." "Whole wheat toast and coffee for me," Richard added. "And maybe a side of fruit today." Nancy raised her eyebrows with exaggerated surprise. "Fruit? Well, Mr. Harper, you're just full of surprises these days." Richard smiled. Over the past months, he and Nancy had developed a friendly rapport. She no longer seemed intimidated by his wealth, and he had come to genuinely appreciate her straightforward, warm manner. As Nancy walked away to place their order, Lily opened her backpack and pulled out a paper. "I got an A on my science project. Ms. Peterson said our ecosystem diorama was the best in the class." Richard took the paper, looking at the large red A at the top and the teacher's comments about Lily's excellent work. "That's wonderful, Lily. I'm so proud of you." "Ben and I worked really hard on it," Lily said. "He's super smart about science stuff." Richard noticed the slight blush on his daughter's cheeks when she mentioned her project partner. He hid a smile, recognizing the signs of a first crush. "Well, your hard work paid off," Richard said, handing the paper back. "We should celebrate. How about a movie this afternoon?" Lily's eyes lit up. "Can we see the new superhero one?" "Emma at school said it's really good." "Whatever you want," Richard agreed easily. Nancy returned with their drinks. "Here you go, sweetie," she said, placing the hot chocolate with its mountain of whipped cream in front of Lily. "And black coffee for Dad." "Nancy," Richard said, "I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk after your shift today. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Nancy looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, I finish at 1 today. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Richard assured her. "Just an idea I wanted to run by you." After Nancy left, Lily looked at her father curiously. "What do you want to talk to her about?" "It's a surprise," Richard said. "I'll tell you if it works out." They enjoyed their breakfast, chatting about Lily's school, her friends, and the book. Richard was currently reading a novel, something he hadn't made time for in years. Richard noticed how much more engaged he was in these conversations now. 3 months ago, his mind would have been elsewhere, thinking about work problems or checking his phone constantly. Now he was fully present, genuinely interested in his daughter's life. When they finished eating, Lily asked if she could stay and read her book while Richard talked to Nancy. He agreed, and Lily settled comfortably in their booth with a fantasy novel she was in the middle of. Richard moved to a small table near the counter where Nancy was finishing up her shift duties. The diner was quieter now, the morning rush over. Nancy brought a fresh pot of coffee and 2 cups, sitting down across from Richard. "So what's this mysterious conversation about, Mr. Harper?" Nancy asked, pouring coffee for both of them. "First, please call me Richard," he said. "And second, I want to thank you." Nancy looked confused. "Thank me? For what?" "For helping me see something important without even knowing it," Richard said. He took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "That first day Lily and I came in, she asked me a question about you. She asked why you seemed happier than me, even though I have so much more money." Nancy's eyes widened slightly. "Kids have a way of asking the hard questions, don't they?" "They certainly do," Richard agreed with a smile. "That question changed everything for me. It made me look at my life differently, made me question what really matters." "And what did you decide matters?" Nancy asked. "Relationships, purpose. Being part of something bigger than yourself," Richard said. "The things you have here, connections with people, being part of this community, finding meaning in your work. I had none of that. I had wealth and success, but I was missing everything that makes life worth living." Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "Money makes life easier in many ways, but it doesn't automatically make it better." "Exactly," Richard said, "which brings me to what I wanted to discuss with you." Richard explained that over the past 3 months he had been making major changes in his life and his company. He had reduced his working hours, delegated more responsibilities, and started a foundation focused on community development. "I've been thinking about how to make a real difference in people's lives," Richard said. "Not just by writing checks, but by creating opportunities. And I had an idea I wanted to run by you." Richard's idea was to start a program that would help small local businesses like Sunnyside Up expand or improve without losing their character or community connections. The program would provide funding, business advice, and support, but the GI owners would maintain control. "I'd like to use Sunnyside Up as the pilot for this program," Richard said. "If you and the owner are interested, of course." Nancy stared at him for a long moment. "I am the owner, Richard. I bought this place from the previous owner 10 years ago." Now it was Richard's turn to be surprised. "You own the diner? I thought you were just a waitress?" Nancy finished with a smile. "I am a waitress. I'm also the owner, the bookkeeper, the occasional cook, and whatever else needs doing. I like being on the floor, talking to people. That's the part of the business I love most." Richard nodded, impressed. "That makes this even better. Would you be interested in hearing more about the program?" "I might be," Nancy said cautiously. "But I need to know this place would stay the same. I don't want it turned into some fancy, expensive restaurant that my regular customers can't afford." "That's exactly what I don't want," Richard assured her. "The whole point is to preserve what makes places like this special while helping them thrive." They talked for another half hour, with Richard explaining more details of his idea and Nancy asking thoughtful, practical questions. By the end of their conversation, Nancy agreed to consider the proposal. "I'll need to see everything in writing," she said, "and I'll want my lawyer to look it over." "Of course," Richard said. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As they stood up, Nancy surprised Richard by giving him a quick hug. "Your daughter asked a good question that day. I'm glad it led to something positive for you." Richard smiled. "Me too." Back at their table, Lily closed her book and looked up expectantly. "So, Did she like your idea? She's thinking about it, Richard said, but I think it might work out. As they left the diner, Richard's phone rang. It was Alan Porter, his COO, calling about a potential crisis with the company's latest product launch. 3 months ago, Richard would have immediately jumped into fix-it mode, canceling his plans with Lily and focusing entirely on work. Today, he told Alan to handle it, that he trusted his judgment and that they could discuss it on Monday morning. Then he turned off his phone and put it in his pocket. "Ready for that movie?" he asked Lily. She grinned and took his hand. "Ready." As they walked down the street together, Richard thought about how much had changed in just 3 months. He had restructured his company to be more employee-focused and socially responsible. He had started spending meaningful time with Lily, rebuilding their relationship. He had even begun cautiously dating again, having dinner with Caroline once a week to see if they might find their way back to each other. None of these changes had decreased his wealth. In fact, his company was doing better than ever, with employee satisfaction and productivity both up significantly. But the real difference was in how Richard felt. The emptiness that had haunted him despite his success was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection he hadn't felt in decades. All because his daughter had asked him a simple question about a waitress in a diner. They stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Lily looked up at her father. "Dad, are you happy now?" Richard looked down at his daughter, her honest eyes watching him carefully. He thought about the question, about everything that had happened, about the path ahead. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The light changed and they crossed the street together, father and daughter hand in hand, stepping into their new life with each other. Behind them, the sign for Sunny Side Up Diner caught the autumn sunlight, glowing bright against the city skyline. Inside, Nancy poured coffee for another customer, sharing a joke and a smile, rich in the ways that truly mattered.